Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Straw Greenhorn. And it came to pass on the next day that he entered into a city called Nain with much of his disciples and much people with him. Now it came to pass as he approached unto the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being brought out, the only son of his mother. She was now widowed, with much of the people of the city with her. Now it came to pass that when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and those that bare him stood still. And Jesus said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. And he that had been dead sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. So here we see Jesus after the healing of the centurion's servant, where he said, Lord, I'm not worthy for thee to come under my roof. Just say the word, and my servant shall be healed. Jesus marveled, I've never seen such great faith not in Israel. So we get the understanding right now that he's still in Galilee. We know that he just healed the centurion's servant in Capernaum, which is also a city of Galilee. So Nain, Ain, being also a city of Galilee. So we see right here how Jesus, his fame is increasing, right? And if you understand the multitude of his miracles, how the people, they weren't really seeing anything like this anywhere before. If you check the Old Testament, if you saw any healings of leprosy, it was the Naaman the Syrian. If you saw people being brought back from the dead, it was that little child, Elijah, and then Elisha, when they were carrying that man, he was having a funeral, and I believe one of the prophets touched his bones and he came back to life. Ezekiel, I believe it was in the valley of the dry bones. Son of man, can these dry bones live? And there stood up an exceeding great army. So we understand that his momentum is going, right? So the people, they're following him, no doubt. We understand that there's different, people been following him for different times. There's some that's been following him since Capernaum, where he just came from. Some following him from the time before that, and even the time before that. Now we understand that some of them would even follow him for a short time. Some of them might have even been there from the beginning. We just saw him choose the 12 apostles, and we understand that he selected them from the selection, the wide number that he had. Understanding that he had many disciples, that people that followed him, right? So, understand that some that followed him, he healed them. And if he didn't heal them, then, he did something for them. They might have had family member that was sick, a child, a parent, a spouse, like a brother, distant, relatives, or, even a friend, an acquaintance. We just saw the man that was sick of the palsy. He was born, by friends. So this multitude of people, I mean, it's so vast. And, the things that he's doing is so activating, right? And you understand that this leaves them with a certain expectation, with a certain feeling, being a part of his crowd, seeing him unlock the limits of life, push the boundaries. It seemed as if with each thing that he did, he showed them that his power is even beyond what they were expecting or hoping for. When he healed leprosy, okay, so we can do skin things. When he healed the palsy, okay, so this man, he was born with this. And, look at these muscles, how rigid they are. He's bedridden. We haven't seen him touch any blind yet. But we understand that they've been bringing people onto him. So no doubt, people with chronic diseases, people with, serious things, people with, smaller things, like they might have, headaches that they get, people with cancers, they didn't have the, medical technology that we have today to diagnose these things. But, no matter what it was, he was able to heal it. So we see him, building a lot of momentum here. And he's coming into town. And he's coming in hot, right? So he has this, multitude of disciples. So the apostles, we understand that they are with him, even though they're not, mentioned individually. We see also a multitude. So now we understand that in this multitude, different people are there for different reasons. Some are there for the right reasons, some are there for the wrong reasons, some are there, they're just curious, some have bad intentions. As you'll find with any crowd of people, not everybody's gonna be there for you. So we see him coming into this town of Nain, Nain, and we understand that they see a procession, a funeral going on. So this woman, she has now lost her son, and it was said that she was a widow, from before. Now it doesn't really, it doesn't give her age. Was she older? Was she middle, in the middle, or towards the younger part? Because the age of the son is not given. But we can understand that if he were a child, usually they're mentioned as children. The woman is not meet to take little children's bread, cast to little dogs. she had a daughter, and we understand that she was young. The man who they failed to cast the devil out of his son, when he was transfigured and he came down from the mountain, we understand that that was a child. The ruler of the synagogue, his little daughter, like at home. So they usually mention when it's a child, right? So I would lean on the side that it's not a person that was that young, and he did address him as young man. So I would guess to say that she was somewhere in her 40s, maybe 45, or 43 to 45 range. Even though she could have been older, she could have been younger. I might be completely wrong. But just going by the language that the Bible likes to use, right? Having read this thing many times. So now she has this son, right? And no other children. Now we know that she was not barren, right? Because she did have this child, right? But what's unusual is that usually in those days you see a larger family, 12, 15 children. It's in these modern times that we see the 2, 3, 4, children households. So we understand that it's the children that take care of the parents, right? When they get older. We don't really see women working in those days. So we see also, Jesus, speaking in a divine way. Young man, I say unto thee. How they, addressed him in such a way. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. We understand that, he's been viewed right now, in like a divine way. This is not just a simple man, walking about. And we get an understanding also of, the difference in his heart, versus a typical other minister, how he operates, from compassion, right? His heart is not tainted with the need for material things or, fame or the company of men, which is what drives a lot of these things in others that you'll get to observe. So like I said, we really see him showing his compassion, the motivation for his ministry. Compare that to anybody else who they do this for the wrong reasons. So we see Jesus also speaking from his authority, understanding that man's authority is not his authority, and the things that he says is not as when other men say. Him giving this command, I say unto thee, arise. And if you can picture him, in the beginning was the word was with God, and the word was God. Jesus being God himself. So we understand that even though he is fully man, he's also fully God. And in this moment we really see such a beautiful, compassionate side of him. I think one of the great differences between him is that he's able to put himself in our shoes. And the irony of that is that we walk in these shoes, and how we are unable to put ourselves in these shoes for other people. While him, they said that he left the splendor of heaven, come to be crucified, to be rejected, by this people. In the aftermath of this healing, how this man, how he rose up. When Jesus heals, there's no recovery time. When Jesus heals, it's just, you're good to go. All right, so I would say overall, this experience, right place, right time, right? He just got done speaking of how there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elias, but only that non-Israel widow from Sarepta, a city of Sidon, was healed. Many lepers in Israel in Eliseus, days. Naaman the Syrian, a non-Israel. So now this lady being an Israelite, right? Right place, right time. Because if you think about it, last woman that lost her son, 3 years ago, too early. And the next woman that would lose it 3 years after this, too late. Even though the disciples were around, and they, no doubt would have had the ability to at least do something about it, right? All right, so how did we get here? In the early parts of the 7th chapter of Luke, where it started out saying, and when he had ended all his sayings in the audience of the people, he entered into Capernaum. Now there was a certain centurion whose servant was sick, who was there unto him, sick, ready to die. And when he heard of Jesus, he sent unto him the elders of the Jews, beseeching him to come and heal his servant. And when they came unto him, they instantly besought Jesus, saying that he was worthy for whom he should do this, for he loveth the people and has built, us, our nation, a synagogue. So Jesus went down with them. And while he was, not far from the house, the centurion sent, certain friends unto him, saying, Master, trouble not thyself. I am not worthy that thou shouldest enter unto my roof. Neither thought I worthy to come unto thee. But say in a word, and my servant shall be healed. For I am a man also set under authority. I say to this one, go, he goeth. I say to this one, come, he cometh. I say to this one, do that, and he doeth it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled and turned him about, and said unto the multitude that followed him, I say unto you, I have not seen such great faith, no, not in Israel. And when those that were sent, returned to the house, they found the servant whole that had been sick. So then we pick up right here where it says, and it came to pass on the next day he entered into a city called Nain with many of the disciples and much people. So still in Galilee, leaving from Capernaum to here. I would ask the question, how does he strategize, what town to go to next? It's the second time in Capernaum. But the first time he was there, it was after he was, rejected from Nazareth. In Capernaum, he healed the man with an unclean spirit and then, cast out Simon Peter's wife's mother's fever. And then as the sun was setting, they brought unto him all that had any sick with diverse diseases. So now here in Nain, we no doubt we understand that this is a close, region. So, no doubt they're hearing about him, right? Of all the things that he's doing and what he's able. And, in those days, remember, they had no social media, no internet, no cell phones. No, everybody's glued to their cell phones, so less distractions. So something like this, people, they would seek it out. This was their entertainment, stepping apart from their rather maybe, simpler lives. This was something to be a part of. This was something to be excited about. So he enters into this city, Nain, Nain. So the disciples, are mentioned. We just saw him pick the 12. We really only saw the recruitment of Simon Peter and his brother Andrew and James and John. The rest of them, they were just kind of there, right? And he just chose them. But I think that it would have been so interesting to show how Judas came on board. Knowing that he would have such a pivotal role in his story. How he was the betrayer. Where did he meet him? Did he come with somebody sick? Was he himself sick? What was the conversation about when he met him? Was he by himself? Did he come with others? What town or what location exactly? The Bible, I don't think it tells his occupation. You'd have to maybe go to one of the Bible scholars, to hear that. And this multitude, they're following him. So understand that there's a mixture of, length of time that these people are around him. No doubt, some of them are about to get on board in Nain. Some of them are about to, start returning home. Some of them are going to continue with him. What's interesting, I think, we don't really see him, his eating is not really, shown how, where he eats and when and what time and how. We know that it was shown, he just went to Simon Peter's house, so no doubt he ate there. He recruited, Levi, the publican sitting at the receipt of customs. He made him a feast in his own house. Zacchaeus of little stature, he made him a feast, no doubt. He said, I must dine at thy house. He went to the wedding in Cana of Galilee where he turned the water into wine. He no doubt, ate there. So no doubt, understand, he's rolling through, right? Coming in hot and heavy. All right, so the next one says, and when he was nigh unto the gates of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was now widowed, and most people of the city was with her. So he's, entering into this city. And he's, no doubt spots this procession. And, if you can imagine what's going on, how, when people are standing around doing nothing, how they'll look a certain way, like not as focused. But, people, something going on, like maybe a concert, some sort of rally or meeting, a speech, some organized group, how focused, people's body language is going to be different. They're going to be about business. So he's able to see this, from afar off, no doubt. And no doubt they're able to see him, this multitude. So it's given that this, body was dead. It was, being carried out. So his sickness is not mentioned. Like I said, even though they had limited diagnoses, no symptoms were given. How long was he sick for? His father was widowed. Was it the same thing? Is this a generational thing? Something in the bloodline, whether it be spiritually or in the flesh. So now we understand that it's a great time of bereavement for her. Because, like I said, the children were expected to take care of the parents. That's why Jesus was having such a hard time with scribes and Pharisees who were telling these children to say korban to their parents, which is basically saying that, if thing I do for you after this point, consider that a blessing. I'm not required to do anything. Now her financial, situation is not given. Another thing that he was grieved with them. Devouring widows' houses. This is, a target for her. So no, her financial situation is not given. Was she well off? Was she in the middle? Was she, about to be in poverty? So we understand that this is a great time of bereavement, having lost her son and having no other children. And we know that there's a law where it says, if a man's brother die having no children, brother should take the wife and raise up seed unto his brother. So now, if this man has a brother, that's not mentioned. Because if he doesn't, then there's nobody to take her, her and raise up seed unto him. And she had this one child, so the law, it did not apply here. Did she have other family members? Did she have brothers and sisters? Who maybe had children that would help take care of auntie when the time came. So we see her having much support behind her. It said that much people from the city. And that really shows a disadvantage of this present day and technology and all the things that we have available. Screen time and social media. How in those days they didn't have this distraction, so they had to seek each other. They had to be active in each other's lives, more personally. I mean, in this day and age, a lot of people spend time watching TV or glued to their phones. Even elderly people, they stay at home with the TV on all day. Whether it be even in a nursing home. So that's one of the things that we have lost, due to technology. How all these people were behind this woman like this. And everybody was there. Everybody came out to show their support. Now, judging by, certain stories in the Bible, we understand that, even if they did show their support, that, it wasn't gonna be an extended support. That same, with a woman from Sarepta, she was consuming her last cake of meal. The barrel, it was about to be empty. When Elijah was sent onto her. We didn't really see support, for her. So, it's understanding that they would show support, but, how far would that support go? All right, so the next verse says, "And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said, Weep not." So, this is a real timeless statement. How they put him in the third person. You almost get a sense it's not even Jesus the prophet that's walking around, but this is Jesus in the beginning was the word. That's you're about to see. How they address him in such the language. "And when the Lord saw her," so this is the Lord. Many servants call their master or Lord, but taking out of context, you don't call them Lord, right? Unless they're in their place of lordship, like in their house or their business. Usually, you're not gonna call them Lord. You call Jesus Lord anywhere, and we see him having compassion on her. Now that's the hallmark of the difference with Jesus versus other preachers. How everything he does is from compassion. When he fed the multitude with the fishes and the loaves, Bible says he lifted up his eyes and beheld the multitude. They were as sheep having no shepherd. And he said, they have been with me now 3 days. If I send them away fasting, many of them shall faint in the way, because many of them came from so far. A difference between, maybe a regular preacher, they might do this and then be so focused on, spreading what they did, the fame part, being known, being invited to important places, getting more, members, more tithing, more offerings, right? To be mentioned, to be, celebrity status. So when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. It's amazing how this, important God, this God that made all things, how in his mind, he can single down to one individual person and give them his full attention, undivided, when he's over so many things. You would almost get the sense that he has too many things to be watching over to have time for something like this. We see the complete opposite. We see it's almost as if when he's dealing with a person, you would think that that's the only person he ever made. I think that's something that comes across so loud about him. When he deals with a person, you would think as if that's the only person he ever made. He made one person, this person. The care, the detail, the attention that he gives, the respect, the consideration, how he sympathizes with them. He puts himself in their shoes. How he's able to, even anticipate some of the things of their lives, the needs that are yet to arise. He truly is worthy. I think, we don't understand the luck that we have in this God that we, find ourselves with. 'Cause the luck of the draw, he could have been anyway, right? He could have been impersonal, he could have been sour. He didn't have to be good. What if, he was the one wanting to see us suffer, wanting to see us, in pain and suffering, in setbacks, in frustrations. What if instead of healing his, MO was to cause, disease? What if instead of deliverance, it was to weigh you down? Or he could have been just completely nonchalant, He's like, you figure it out. Some, get good, some get bad. That's it. Because, I mean, nothing would affect him, right? But, just how closely knit he is to his creation, that he really doesn't leave us, behind. He doesn't leave us, out of his mind. And, everything that he does, it is from compassion. Understanding how a demon possessed person, how they are unable to live a full life and to function. When these things can show up at any time and, they are unable to keep a job, probably can't have a marriage with kids. Nobody wants to be left out. Everybody wants to be included. Everybody wants to love and be loved. And I would ask the question: is this why his ministry is so powerful? Is this why his power is so powerful? Because even in others, performing miracles, I think have a tendency to make it about themselves. I did this, I did that. It's like, look at what I'm able to do, as opposed to the compassion part. Looking at this person suffer and relieving their pain. Freeing them from these constraints and these shackles. Watching them walk and be free. Alright, so the next verse says, then he came to the bier, touched it, and those that bore him stood still. And Jesus said, son, I say unto thee, arise. So he came and he touched this thing. So we understand that this bier, B-I-E-R, they're either, carrying him like in some sort of coffin, or he's being pulled, like on a wagon, by like a donkey or one of those strong, animals. So notice that he touched the bear and not the man. I think this, can show that, he doesn't need to touch him to heal him. It's kind of like one of those faith things. Blessed is he that believe and had not seen. Him not touching him is like not seeing. Versus, if I had to touch him, then I would be limited by physical contact, right? He just healed the centurion servant. The centurion said, just say the word. I'm not worthy for you to come to my roof. Just say the word and it will be done. And he did, and it was done. So he said unto him, man, I say unto thee, arise. So now, this is Jesus speaking. We know that the Bible says that, all will hear the voice. All will hear his voice. All that sleep will hear his voice and shall be awakened. Some to eternal punishment, some to eternal bliss, some to eternal life, eternal, joy. So, you would think that he would only have this power when it's time for the judgment. But no, he has it at all times, and he's using it right now. We know that he just told them that he's, Lord of the Sabbath also, when they were plucking the ears of corn on the Sabbath. He just healed the man lying in the bed of the palsy. He said, thy sins be forgiven thee. We know that he's able to forgive sins also, so that's available to him also. One of the things we know that's not available is forgiving, the blasphemy of the Holy Ghost. I would ask the question if he doesn't have the authority to override this thing. Because, does he not consider context? What if somebody was holding a gun to this person's head? Literally telling them to blaspheme the Holy Ghost. Would he not consider that? Another thing that's not available to him. He said, no man knoweth the day nor the hour, not the Son of Man, not the angels in heaven, but the Father only. So right here we see him able to wake the dead, and he doesn't have to wait until judgment day. Alright, so the last verse says, and he that had been dead, sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. So he sits up and begins speaking. Right then and there. No need, no rehab, no need, no recovery time, no 6 weeks bed rest. Understand with Jesus that when he heals, he fixes everything. He might go in for one thing, he's gonna see everything, and address it, as necessary. So now I would ask the question, when they saw him rise up, was anybody afraid to see this dead man come back to life? Because they knew that he was dead. They saw him, there's a change in a person that dies, how their face looks so different and their body. Was anyone afraid, seeing this man sit up like this, afraid to, even step back a little? He began to speak, I wonder what he said. What was he thinking about? Did he get to see heaven or hell, the afterlife like that? It didn't say how long he was dead for, but dead enough to be, about to be buried. So they were taking him. He was by the gate of the city, right? Because it said that when he, drew nigh unto the gate of the city, then he saw all this. Where they're taking him out the city to bury him. Were there not any cemeteries in the city? I'm Straw Greenhorn.